The morning sun painted the city in golden light, casting long shadows on the glass and steel buildings. The air was still cool, carrying the last vestiges of the night, and the streets of the residential area were beginning to come to life. A few joggers, busy executives, and uniformed servants passed each other, each immersed in their routine. Malik Diallo slowed his pace and placed his hands on his hips, catching his breath. He had just run 10 kilometers, a ritual he never missed, even when he was on a mission or traveling. Athletic and disciplined, he considered running not just a physical exercise, but a mental workout. Automatically, he wiped his forehead with his forearm, enjoying the burn of the effort in his muscles. His black tracksuit was slightly damp with sweat, hugging his torso sculpted by years of rigorous training. His gaze roamed the clean, spotless streets of the upscale neighborhood where he had just finished his journey. Malik was not an ordinary man. He was the son of General Idris Diallo, Chief of Staff of the country's armed forces, a man whose name inspired respect, sometimes fear. But he didn't like to rely on this heritage. He had grown up under iron discipline, raised with a single credo: what you get should come from your merit, not your name. From a very young age, he had trained himself to be demanding, refusing privileges. He had entered the military academy on his own and shone in the most grueling exercises. He was preparing to enter an elite unit, where only the best were accepted. His father would have wanted him in politics or at the top of the military hierarchy, but Malik had chosen the field, the action, the adrenaline. As he crossed the street to buy a bottle of water at a kiosk, a patrol car suddenly slowed past him, interrupting the calm of the morning. A shrill squeal of brakes sounded, breaking the quiet hum of the city. 2 police officers got out immediately. One of them, a man with a massive build and a face marked by contemptuous confidence, immediately placed a hand on his weapon. The other, younger, glanced hesitantly at his colleague before staring at Malik with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "Hey you!" cried the first, his voice hard and sharp. "What are you doing here?" Malik turned around, surprised by the aggressiveness of the tone. He hadn't done anything suspicious. He was just another jogger among many, but he knew. He knew exactly why he had been stopped. "I run, like every morning, officer." His voice was calm, composed, but tinged with a touch of weariness. He had experienced this kind of situation before. Too often. The hard-faced agent Morel, according to his badge, raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Your papers," he barked without preamble. There was no please, no explanation. Only an order, cold and brutal. Malik knew he had no obligation to justify himself in this way, but he did not want any unnecessary escalation. He took a deep breath, took a step forward, and slowly took out his ID card from the inside pocket of his jacket. He handed it over without a word. The other policeman, Durand, took it and examined it for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly when he read the name. "Diallo," he whispered, looking up. "Is this a joke?" Morel moved closer, casting a disdainful glance at Malik, then at the map. "A problem with my name?" Malik asked, crossing his arms. Morel did not answer immediately. His gaze, full of suspicion, passed from the document to the young man's impassive face. He took a step forward, placing himself at a deliberately threatening distance. "You're shady. We've had complaints about guys like you hanging around the neighborhood for a while." A silence settled. A heavy silence, filled with almost palpable tension. Malik stared at him, unblinking. "My type." He smiled coldly. "Do you mean black?" Durand looked away slightly, uncomfortable. Morel clenched his jaw. "Shut up. You answer too much." And without warning, he gave him a violent slap. The sharp sound echoed in the morning air, freezing the surrounding passers-by. Malik felt the burn on his cheek, but he didn't flinch. His military training had prepared him for worse. He just stared at Morel with icy intensity. Around them, murmurs began to rise. A woman stopped with her shopping bag, her mouth half open. An old man walking his dog shook his head in disapproval. A young teenager, phone in hand, had already started filming the scene. "Why did you hit me?" Malik asked, his voice firm, his eyes flashing with suppressed anger. Morel expected to see resentment, fear, or even submission in his eyes. He sees nothing but contempt. Frustrated, he pushed him roughly against the hood of the car and, in the same movement, handcuffed him with unnecessary violence. Resistance to a check, suspicion of theft. "Theft of what?" Malik asked without raising his voice. Morel did not answer immediately. He knew his accusation didn't hold water, but he didn't care. "We'll see," he finally blurted out, crushing it against the sheet metal. Durand, more and more uncomfortable, looked around him. Witnesses multiplied. Phones went up. "Morel, are you sure?" he murmurs. "Shut up and load it into the car." And this is how Malik Diallo, son of the highest-ranking officer in the army, was taken on board like an ordinary criminal. The passers-by had seen everything. And what they didn't know was that the man who had just been humiliated like this was not the type to let things happen. The storm hadn't started yet. But it was coming. The police station was an austere building, with dull walls and pale neon lights. The smell of cold coffee and stagnant sweat hung in the air, contrasting with the bustle behind the reception desk. Officers came and went, some typing reports on old computers, others joking loudly, oblivious to the cells behind them where inmates awaited their fate. Malik was unceremoniously taken to a recording room. He knew the procedure. Confiscation of personal effects, summary search, fingerprinting. He let it happen, maintaining an almost military calm. He had nothing to reproach himself for. His gaze remained impassive, but deep inside him, a cold anger boiled. Agent Morel, still full of confidence, remained nearby, a smirk hanging on his lips. For him, Malik was just another black man who thought he belonged in a neighborhood where he wasn't supposed to be. A more senior officer eventually entered the room. Middle-aged, with graying temples, he looked jaded, tired of a routine that he performed mechanically. He sat behind a desk and consulted a file without even looking up. "Name?" he asked in a monotone. "Malik Diallo." The man tapped a few keys on his keyboard, then stopped abruptly. His gaze slowly drifted towards Malik, a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. "Diallo, like General Diallo?" "He's my father." The silence that followed was deafening. Agent Morel, still leaning against a wall, burst out laughing, a mocking and contemptuous laugh. "Stop your bullshit. A general's son hanging out in a tracksuit in a rich neighborhood? Do you really think I'm going to buy that?" Malik stared at him unblinkingly, his expression betraying neither panic nor irritation. "Call him." The more senior officer hesitated. He glanced uncertainly at Morel, who shrugged contemptuously, then grabbed his phone. He hesitated for another second before dialing a number. On the other end of the line, there was a dial tone. Just one. Then a deep, sharp voice replied. "General Idris Diallo." The man straightened instinctively, his posture immediately changing under the weight of the authority on the line. "My general." His voice trembled slightly. "Yes, it's about your son." He didn't have time to finish his sentence. An icy voice cut him off. "My son? Where is he?" The officer glanced furtively at Malik, who hadn't moved, then at Morel, whose arrogance was beginning to crack. "He is at the police station, General." There was a mistake. The silence on the other end of the line was more terrifying than any threat. Then, in a voice as sharp as a blade, the general blurted, "I'm coming." The call was cut off abruptly. The officer remained frozen for a few seconds, as if he finally realized the seriousness of the situation. Morel still seemed incredulous. "PFF, he's bluffing. Do you really think that General Diallo will come for you?" He sneered, crossing his arms. But barely 30 minutes later, a black sedan with tinted windows suddenly stopped in front of the police station. 2 military vehicles followed closely behind her. The doors opened at once, and 4 uniformed senior officers strode down, their impeccable appearance contrasting with the unkempt atmosphere of the police station. Then, in icy silence, General Idris Diallo emerged from the sedan. Imposing, dressed in his decorated uniform, he walked with a firm and controlled step, his face impassive like a marble sculpture. But his eyes, dark and piercing, flashed. The lobby of the police station froze instantly. Officers, who moments earlier were joking loudly, looked down and awkwardly got up from their seats. Even the suspects in the cells approached the bars, sensing that something unusual was happening. The general walked through the door without a word. His aura alone was enough to impose silence. His gaze swept around the room. Then he saw his son, sitting on a bench, handcuffed. Something in his expression changed, imperceptibly, but dangerously. "Take that away from him immediately," he thundered in a voice that sounded like a battle order. The policemen jumped and hurriedly complied, their trembling hands struggling against the lock of the handcuffs. Morel, still convinced that he had done nothing wrong, shrugged his shoulders and took a step forward. "Sorry, General, but your son was a suspect. We couldn't guess." Diallo approached slowly, each of his steps echoing in the oppressive silence of the police station. His impeccable uniform contrasted with the palpable tension in the room. His piercing gaze stopped on Morel, who, for the first time, seemed to realize the extent of his error. "Suspect of what?" he asked in a dangerously calm voice. "To be black in a white neighborhood?" Morel swallowed, searching for words, but nothing came. The confidence he had displayed a few minutes earlier had evaporated, replaced by poorly concealed worry. "It's not," he tried to explain. "Silence." Diallo cut in sharply. General Diallo had not raised his voice, but the authority that emanated from him was implacable. He turned to the officer in charge, a middle-aged man who, under the weight of the general's gaze, suddenly seemed to have aged 10 years. "Agent Morel, you hit my son and arrested him without justification. You have abused your power." A heavy silence fell in the room. The other agents, usually so quick to side with one of their own, this time avoided the general's gaze. The injustice of the situation was too blatant to ignore. "I want a full report on this matter within the hour," Diallo added, his voice even colder. "And I want the surveillance videos." The officer in charge, overwhelmed by the pressure, nodded, wiping his forehead with a nervous gesture. "Of course, General," he murmured, aware that any attempt to dodge would only make the situation worse. The scandal broke the next day. Images of the arrest, captured by surveillance cameras but also by witnesses, were leaked on social networks. They showed Morel pinning Malik to the ground with disproportionate violence, ignoring his protests and the contempt written on his face as he handcuffed him like a criminal. The indignation was immediate. Thousands of shares, articles, televised debates. In a few hours, the affair went viral. The streets of the city saw support rallies flourish, with young people carrying signs demanding justice, denouncing police blunders. Morel, until then convinced of being untouchable, found himself cornered. Journalists besieged his house. His face made the headlines with scathing headlines. "Agent Morel caught in the act of abuse of power, systemic racism, an agent suspended after a violent slip-up." Unable to justify his action, he was immediately suspended and subjected to an internal investigation. His colleagues, who a few days earlier had greeted him with complicity, now avoided appearing with him. He had become a burden. Under media and popular pressure, the Minister of the Interior spoke on television. His tone was intended to be firm, but his look betrayed his discomfort. "We will not tolerate any abuse in our law enforcement. This incident is unacceptable and will be treated with the utmost severity." Despite this statement, Malik knew that these words were just a facade. He had seen others, promises of reform that evaporated as soon as the cameras moved away. He also knew that, without his father's identity, this case would have been dismissed, relegated to a simple footnote in the endless list of ignored injustices. He refused to let this story end there. So he made a decision. He used his voice, not just to tell his story, but to denounce these practices on a large scale. He gave interviews, joined collectives, spoke with other victims and carried their voices in forums and on television sets. He didn't just want his own righteousness. He wanted what had happened to him to never happen again. Because a name shouldn't be the only thing that protects a man from injustice.